Okay, guys, here is your third lecture for Humanities 1, and a little confession to start with. I'm barely ready to do this. I've been sick all weekend, so I'm a little low on energy right now, but I'm going to soldier on and see if we can get something here for you guys to look at. Um, I want to start with our questions, and then I want to make some just general observations about this part of our textbook. Um, this is a vast, vast field, and one of the problems with a class like this is that there's just not enough time to cover all of the things that are really interesting and ought to be covered, really. You could spend your life studying any of these civilizations. We're dealing with thousands of years of history and the advent of civilization in three different basic areas amongst four different peoples. And so we're just going to kind of try to hit the high points, and I'm going to try to distill some of this into what I think are the basic essentials I would like you to get from this particular um, section of our textbook. Um, First I want to mention that there seems to be some confusion about the discussion questions, and so I'm going to try to deal with it here and also in our course announcements. It appears that some people are simply writing the questions that are in the book, and that's not really what I want. I can read the book. I want to know your questions. The idea is for you to engage in this material in a creative kind of way. There's too much of this education that consists of regurgitate what's in the book. A great many online classes are done that way, and I can't stand it. And so that's why I've tried to let you guys have some input into the things that we discuss. And so please, come up with some original questions, things that you are curious about yourself. I had a few people who seem to think that they should ask a question and answer it themselves, and that's not really what I want to do here. Your chance to talk about your own ideas comes in the short essays, but for the sake of these discussion questions, I just want some well-considered questions that then I can tackle and try to integrate into my lecture. Once again, if there are any questions, I'll probably end up saying this every single lecture, right? If there are any questions, call me, text me, get a hold of me. So let's start. I want to start with a basic question. Where did the gods and goddesses come from? How did they come about? Uh, this is an interesting question that there's no way I have enough time to answer. But I'm just going to try to sketch the broad outline of this. In the paganism of antiquity, you see that several different cultures arise with various gods. And these gods are generally associated with forces of nature and or forces within the human being. And so anything that seems too big or seems, what's the word for this? Awesome. Okay, there's a great word. Um, Sublime. There's a technical meaning to this. When a human being sees something that is so big and so vast and so powerful that they cannot take it all in. Human beings, just as a species, we tend to have this very visceral emotional response to that. One good word for this is numinous. Numinous means the sense of the presence of the divine. And so people go and chase tornadoes for this reason. They will risk their lives to get right up next to a tornado because it's so powerful and it's so big, and it somehow it calms and stills us. It engages us in a sense of wonder, and so they do it. This is for the same reason people go and stalk apex predators, right? Because there's something poignant and something that draws people about these majestic, gigantic, dangerous animals, right? Well, the pagans would have had a god to represent all of those things. If you could transport an Egyptian or a Babylonian or an Assyrian or um, a Greek to Oklahoma, there would be a god of tornadoes. There would definitely, absolutely be a god associated with tornadoes. Um, but also, the gods are associated with the inner workings of a person. Both the Greeks and the Romans had the goddess of love, right? Venus or Aphrodite, depending on which culture you were in, because love and attraction is a powerful thing. And it seems to just hit us out of nowhere, and it alters the course of our lives. We can seem powerless against this incredible emotion of attraction. In the Greek pantheon, the most fearsome god of all, the one that everyone was afraid of, was Cupid, because Cupid shows up on the scene in a lot of ancient mythology and messes stuff up. He has just as much power over the gods as over mortals, and by forcing people to fall in love, great tragedies can be brought about. And of course, we kind of see this in our own day and age, right? We all know of people, maybe we've had the experience ourselves, of being in love with someone and it was not a good idea, and yet it seemed impossible to avoid. Well, the Greeks are absolutely going to assign a god to that particular emotion. And this went on. And as we get into the Romans, we'll see how the classical paganism of the Greeks and the Romans ended up being this enormous thicket of all these different gods for all these different things. It really gets crazy after a while. But that's the basis behind paganism. Um, Gods that represent forces that are powerful and awe-inspiring. And it shows kind of this universal idea amongst all of humanity that somewhere behind the reality that we experience, there is some sort of invisible power. And that invisible power must be in some way dealt with, related to. Um, there, there's all these systems of mediation, um, priests and sacrifices, and all kinds of different prayers, um, methods of reaching these gods, of interacting with them. And this is one thing that seems to be universal amongst all of humanity. And so the pagans, that was their particular way of doing it. And the various branches of paganism can be very different indeed. The Assyrian gods, the Babylonian gods, the Mesopotamian gods, right, are different from the Egyptian gods, are different from the Greek gods, are different from the Roman gods that are coming down the road, right? We're getting into Rome real soon after we get to the golden age of Greece. Um, but they did kind of cross-pollinate to some degree. Um, the Romans adopted some of the Egyptian gods. The Romans would look at some of the gods of the peoples they conquered and say, well, that god sounds a whole lot like this god that we worship, and so we'll just incorporate that, or we'll say that particular god is a representation of our God. We'll go into this in more detail when we get to the Romans. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves on that, but I'll give you a quick example. Um, and I also want to say this. I really think my theories about paganism come out of the thought and work of G.K. Chesterton, who's my favorite theologian, philosopher, novelist. He's just a massively amazing literary figure. Um, but he differentiated two kinds of paganism in the ancient world. And I think it's a difference worth noting. Um, you had this kind of, what he thought of as the healthier kind of paganism, where you simply say, oh, here's this massive thing, this awe-inspiring sight or event or emotion, I'm going to assign a god to that. While that got to be kind of weird and crazy and it had its dark side, definitely, it was nothing like the darkness of these other kinds of gods. And these other sorts of gods were widely worshipped in the ancient world, and they were monsters. Molech of the Carthaginians, for instance, and we'll talk eventually about the war between Rome and Carthage, which was essentially a war between this dark, twisted, evil kind of religion and the healthier sort of paganism that we have inherited to this day. We know the names of these Roman heroes, Heracles and Zeus, and well, that's Greek, but Jupiter was basically, the Romans took all the Greek gods and said, okay, here's our version of them. So there's not much difference really between the Greek and the Roman pantheon. But we know these stories, and we watch movies, that tell these myths still to this very day. About the Carthaginians and the gods they worshipped, we know almost nothing. I did a lot of research trying to dig up what Molech's story was, and it's not out there anymore to be found. We can only guess. But what we do know is that the number one mode of worship of Molech was burning a baby alive. That's what the Carthaginians did on a weekly basis in the worship of their gods. And there were other gods in that part of the world in this age that were equally terrible. And the differentiation here is important. And we kind of inherited, guys, the fear or the sense of dread and disgust that those particular religions elicited in the cultures that they ran into, in our own kind of scary things, right? The wicked witch in the woods that wants to put the children in an oven. Well, that story goes all the way back to Carthage and what the Carthaginians were getting up to. And that kind of paganism was different in a specific, essential way. Um, they believed in these gods who governed, right, the invisible world, but they thought they could force the gods' hands. That by doing the right kinds of things, by doing the right sorts of rituals and um, incantations, if you will, they could force their gods to do what they wanted them to. And it turns out, in instance after instance, the worship of these gods, the thing that you had to do to get the gods to be on your side, was the most inhuman thing you could think of doing. And once again, the pinnacle of it was the Carthaginians' worship by human sacrifice of children in a horrible, horrible way. Um, and so want to, those, we'll get to those, we'll get to that. I really think it's an important aspect of antiquity that rarely gets discussed in textbooks like this, um, how different some of these things were. Um, and so that's, basically kind of how the gods come about. A question related to that was about fertility. Like fertility is this recurring theme in all of these different religious systems. And once you kind of know how paganism works, it's very obvious why fertility would be a big deal. Um, Childbirth, right? It's one of the most amazing, moving, awesome things that a human being can experience. The cycles of the seasons, the death and rebirth of everything, right? That tends to go on all around us in everything we see. Um, and even in our own lives, death and birth, right? Big deals. And of course, the religions of this era are going to be tackling those kinds of things. And so, a great deal of paganism, many of the gods and goddesses of paganism are dealing with the issues of birth and death and rebirth and the cycles of life, the rhythms of life that you see around us in the world at large, right? So that's why fertility is a big deal, because in the human experience, it's a big deal. And if your instinct is to put a god, have associated a god with these mighty and powerful experiences, then yeah, that's going to be a big part of paganism, and it was, and it's true in every ancient culture um, had a focus on um, death and birth and the cycles of the seasons. Um, Another question is, what might the sculptures that exhibited people as part human and part beast symbolize? That's a good question, and our book doesn't answer it because this is kind of open for debate, right? No one really knows why they did that, right? Why are the Assyrians representing their god Baal as a part bull and part man? Um, we can speculate about that, right? I could just say, okay, let's think about it. Um, the closest analogy that I can think of in our own time would be your team mascot, right? We have these guys, right? The mascot seems like something we have to have. If we're going to have an organized sports team, got to have a mascot, and that mascot is always part human and part something else. Um, and so I think that probably the simplest answer, and it's probably right, but there's probably a lot more to it than that, is that by melding the qualities of this animal and this person, the person is taking on the attributes of the animal. And so for the Minoans, their big deal was a bull. Bulls are very strong and very powerful and very scary, right? And if you link a human with that, you are ascribing to that person the qualities of the bull. And so um, I think that's probably why we do it, and it's why we do it in our sports teams, right? I hate when they get it wrong, right? Your sports mascot has to be something at least a little bit ferocious, right? At Redlands, it's the cougar, and I'm okay with that, right? That'll work, but the Wichita State Shockers, right? And a shocker is, it's not, we're not talking about electricity. It's somebody gathering grain, right? That's not terribly intimidating. And so I worry about that a little bit, right? UConn's mascot is the Miller, right? Because UConn had this enormous flour mill, which was kind of its claim to fame for a while, but that's been gone for a while, and there's really not much intimidating about a Miller. So, but most of the time, when you look at these teams, right, or these mascots, there's some kind of a ferocious sort of attribution coming from whatever animal, if they have an animal, that they have made their mascot. Um, Next question, is it possible that religion and conflict of beliefs were the root of conflict among different cultures of this time? Why were they in conflict? Over resource, land, religious views, or simply power? And the answer is all of those things. Um, a great deal of human conflict comes about when cultures clash, when incompatible ways of looking at the universe collide with one another. As we go through this class, you will find that human beings have organized their universe in a multitude of different ways. And we talked about that when we looked at the cave paintings right in prehistory. It's like human beings have to define themselves. We just have to. We don't know who we are. And a great deal of religion is about having some kind of a belief system that tells us who we are and what our place in the universe is. And when you have people of different cultures whose way of organizing their reality is incompatible with one another, that usually ends up in some kind of armed conflict. Um, and so, yeah, this is one of the ways that war happens. But it also happens over land, right? As we begin to see the world break up into these various city states, right? One city state wants to have the stuff of another city state, so they take it over, and then that then becomes an empire after a while. And you see that. This is one of the things that happens at this age of humanity. You see all of these, what were hunter-gatherers, right, um, clobbering together into these cities and these city-states, and then the stronger city-states absorbing the other city-states and building empires. And Egypt was one example, and the Mesopotamian kingdoms of the Assyrians and the Sumerians um, and the Persians later on, those are examples of the same thing at work. And then the Romans come along a little bit later in our book, and they stomp a mud hole in everybody. Right? They take this to the next level. Um, and so I want to also say that while this was happening, on the fringes of these empires and these giant city-states, there were still people in loose tribal affiliations who lived as hunter-gatherers. The hunter-gathering stuff didn't completely end all over the planet as soon as the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians decided to be civilized. Right? This was still going on, just out there on the fringes. And this remained true really all the way up until very, very recently. European civilization was what it was. While on the North American and South American continents, you still had, well, especially North American, the Plains Indians, you had hunter-gatherers. And now South America was more city-states, very much like what we're looking at here in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, with the Aztecs and the Mayans. Um, so, you know, these things are still going on up until very, very, very recently. And so, my father knew people who were very old people around Apache, Oklahoma, where I grew up, who had fought alongside Geronimo. Well, Geronimo was one of the last of the shaman chiefs of the Apache Indians, actually the last. And um, they were hunter-gatherers. That's what they were. And so, um, this civilization gets distributed unevenly across the planet. And this uneven distribution of civilization has evened out some in our own time. But as recently as, one very long lifetime ago, it was incredibly unevenly distributed. And so it's kind of what brings us to where we are today with the current world that we live in. Um, Another question, why were members of the priesthood only allowed to go into the temples? The person asked this question says, it doesn't make sense to me that they were the only visitors. If the temples were used as some religious factor, wouldn't they want regular citizens to be able to worship at the temples as well? Um, and this is coming from our current conception of religion, which is very, very different from the ancient idea of religion. And we tend to think of churches, right, where everybody comes and we all participate in whatever's happening in the church. Most ancient religions were not like that at all. You had your priests and you had your acolytes, the people who were in charge of taking care of the priests, priests in training, if you will. But they were the only ones who were supposed to go into the temple and deal with the god. And so there was this kind of mystery that shrouded ancient religion and ancient temples in this way. And you can see how that would be kind of something that would work, right? If you went to the temple to offer your sacrifice and the priest comes out and takes your sacrifice and goes back into the temple where no one can go, right? You don't know what's happening in there. Um, and the priest can come back and say, the God accepted your sacrifice or not. Um, uh, how would you know? Right? And so the thing kind of gets shrouded in mystery, and the special people are the only ones who can have access to these higher realities and divine things. And that's kind of how priesthood works. It's kind of an exclusive sort of thing in ancient paganism. And so, very much everyone outside of the temples were just kind of ordinary folks going about their days. And the job of the priests was to uh, be intermediaries between the ordinary people and the gods. And this is the shape of ancient paganism all over the world. And of course, with this, you have the building of temples, right? And you have the institution of these various priesthoods based on the various different gods. And this was kind of a living, growing sort of way of dealing with the world, of looking at and organizing reality. But it's very different from our understanding of being in a church, where what's happening, especially in Christianity, is something for everyone. And so that's one of the great, great, huge differences between Christianity and all of these other religions that it came along and more or less replaced. Um, there is no exclusivity in that regard. Everyone who's a Christian, from the greatest to the least, has equal access to the divine. And this is not the way religion is done in any other kind of system. And so one of the huge, most earth-shattering changes in religion with the advent of Christianity is that very thing. And we take it for granted because we don't realize this is not what the whole world looked like, in the past. Religion just wasn't done that way. Um, um, well, here's a question: why were the pyramids so big? right? And uh, and why were they shaped that way? And this is it's a great question because look, we're dealing with the world of steel and steel reinforcements, and so our understanding of big buildings is entirely colored by that reality. You see the giant, structures like the Devon Tower that just needs, the big eye of Sauron on top of it. Um, it's this giant, huge structure that looks like it's mostly made of glass, right? How does that thing stand up? Well, steel. We just take it for granted. But when you don't have steel, the only way you're going to build a really, really big monument with stone is by making the base very, very wide and then tapering as you go upward. It's the only way to do it. And so in many ways, the pyramids are shaped that way, not because of some, mystical thing that all these different, cultures make pyramids. But if you're going to make a big building out of stone, that's how you have to do it. And so in all of these different cultures where you see monuments made in stone, from the Egyptians to the Mesopotamians to the Aztecs and the Mayans, right? They have their pyramids. Well, it's a pyramid. That's how you do it. It can't be done any other way. And so that's why they look like that. And of course, this was very difficult to do. The amazing engineering that goes into these things is just mind boggling. If you think about it, right? Think about the great pyramid of Cheops in Giza, right? The giant, they've got those three big ones, right? And then that's the one of them's really, really big. Um, when they built that thing, right, what they had to do was lay down the base layer first. And that base layer would have set the shape of the pyramid going up. And if they had miscalculated, if they were off by even a fraction of an inch at the base of the pyramid would not match up at the top. The lines would not meet, in which case you've built this wonder of the world that doesn't work, right? Um, that's pretty high risk endeavor. And so the engineering and the mathematics and the competence, right, to do something like that, I wouldn't want to take it on. That it was just amazing that they were able to do this, and they did. And by the way, it didn't always work. The Great Pyramids, they were pretty good at building them. There are several examples of very much older pyramids that fell down. They just weren't built sturdily enough to stand the test of time. And so that's why pyramids are shaped the way they are, and that's why they're so big, because that's the only way you can do it. Um, the questions about Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and how they're different. Um, and this is where I want to get into a concept I want us to really focus on. A foundational myth, foundational mythology. Uh, when I said that ancient religion, or all religion, is about people trying to figure out who they are and their place in the world and their relationship to the universe at large. Right? Well, foundational myths do that. They're a story that helps people understand who they are and who they ought to be. So the heroic characters in these stories become paragons, become people to be emulated. And the principles in these stories become aspects of that culture which are important. And so the beginning of this of the Homeric epics, right? I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, is the Iliad. And the Iliad is about the war between the Athenians, the Greeks, and the Trojans. And the setup for this is that one of the princes of Troy has stolen the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. And her husband is going to go get her back. And all of the Greeks get behind this idea. We're going to go get Helen back. And the events of the Iliad are about that particular war and how Troy was eventually overcome and destroyed. The Odyssey is the story of one particular person in that war, Odysseus, and his trip home. He's trying to get home from Troy. And he goes through all of these adventures and all of these hardships and all of these terrible things that happen to him to try to make it home. And he needs to get home and establish himself as the patriarch of his family, and begin life again after the war. And so you can see how these two stories, right? Why would we go to war, and what do we come back for? Why do we fight, and what do we return to after the fighting is over? Well, that's foundational in any experience of war. Our current veterans who come back from the wars that we're involved in the Middle East, right? Why do we fight, and what do we come back for? These questions define the experience of someone who is going to be involved in combat. And in the ancient world, it was no different. And so the Greeks kind of hit upon these epics by Homer to define who they were and what their values were. And so that's, and of course, God, it would take you days to read these. They're enormous. They were originally handed down by word of mouth. Nobody really knows how old they are. Um, and But they did become foundational in Greek culture and Roman culture too. Once again, I keep mentioning Rome, but Rome is coming right around the corner. Right, the Roman story begins with the fall of Troy. The Roman story begins where the Iliad ends, and the refugees from Troy found another city a little further away, which ends up being Rome. And so the foundational mythology of the Aeneid, which is the story of the founding of Rome, one of the stories of the founding of Rome, takes right off after the Homeric epic ends. And of course, you can see in Roman society, right, they adopt most of what the Greeks do. And so you can see how that story dovetails into the Greek story and really helps explain who the Romans are and who they thought they were, what they were trying to do in the world. One of the things I want to talk about to kind of finish up here is you have these three different, four actually, different peoples in the world at this time. You have the Mesopotamians and their various empires and their city-states. You have the Egyptians and their 3,000 years of stability, more or less, right? And you have the Greeks and the civilizations that the Greeks rose out of, the Minoans and other kinds of peoples right around the edges of the Mediterranean there. And you have the Jews. You have the Hebrews. And the Hebrews are their own kind of odd sort of thing. And the story of the Hebrews, which we have in the Old Testament, dovetails into these other civilizations. Abraham, the great patriarch of the Hebrew people, comes from the city of Ur, which is one of the Mesopotamian city-states that is discussed in your textbook. That's where he's from. And God, in the story in the Bible, God takes him away from those people and says, I am the only God, and this is how you should deal with me. Moses, right, who's the next great leader of the Hebrew people, comes from Egypt. Right? They're captive in Egypt. They're slaves of the Egyptians. And the story of Moses is the God taking his people out of Egypt. And so you have Abraham coming out of Ur and the Mesopotamians, that side of the early civilizations around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And then you have God using Moses to take the Hebrews out of Egypt. And that civilization based around the Nile. And then you have this strange thing where these folks wander around in the desert for a long time before they come into the area that ends up being their place. And you have their short-lived kingdom of David and Solomon, which was the kind of the high point of that civilization. And then you have its decline and eventual conquering by Rome. And so I think it's interesting that the Hebrews are their own thing, and they are the only monotheistic religion on the earth. That's the other thing to notice here, right? They are not like any of these other civilizations at all. And most of the Old Testament, a great deal of it, the drama of the Old Testament, is the ways that these people were shaped by the revelation of that there's one true God, one God that rules all, and also their temptation to adopt the religious practices of the paganism that they found themselves in. You see constantly in the story of the Jewish people in the Old Testament this kind of returning to God and falling away from God and worshiping idols and you know, even the Baals, even the Moloch, even some of those really dark, horrible, monstrous religions, they would sometimes fall into. One of the great uh, moments of their falling away, and I forget which book of the Bible this is, but God talks about, or the scriptures talk about, one of the reasons God is angry was because the Hebrews had made their children to pass through the fire. Well, that's the sacrifice to Molech. And so you kind of have this people that coming out of this part of the world and constantly being separated and then re-separated from the various religious and cultural structures that they find themselves in. Um, and so that's kind of their story, and their story ends up being hugely important as we go along, right? Because out of Judaism comes Christianity. Christianity is what ends paganism for good, by the way. That's another curious fact of history. Like this is all of history, right? From prehistory all the way up until um, the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of Rome. You had all of these systems of paganism that were just rolling along and growing and changing, and there were new gods being added all the time, and there were new myths, and it was just this vast, bewildering array of gods towards the end. Uh, and then it stopped, and it has not started again. You don't see, we still have these stories, we still look back to these myths, we still think about the heroic people like Hercules and so forth and so on, but mythology as a living religion just doesn't exist anymore. And Christianity is what put an end to it. So, and of course, Christianity arises out of Judaism. And so, once again, even in that aspect of that particular thread of religion that begins with Abraham and runs all the way through until our present day, you can see this kind of separation from what had been going on before. Um, that's about it, guys. Once again, I can't answer everybody's questions. I wish I could. Um, I want, you know, if you have any questions, please get a hold of me. Sorry about the low energy today, just because I've been sick as a dog all weekend. Um, your first test is up now, should be. If it's not, let me know. Um, and your short essay question should be coming right up in terms of, I forget which day that pops up on, but I'll look and make sure to just check, right? My brain isn't working right now. Um, and I think we're off to a good start. Things are starting to kind of settle into a rhythm here. So uh, look for this again on next Monday. Hopefully I'll get it done Sunday night like I did today. Um, and you know, see if we can kind of get things clicking along here. And we're on our way. So I'll see you guys next week.